everybody. So happy to be here and so excited to get to talk to the wonderful Leslee here all about homeschooling and styles and best practices and also just how to answer those stupid questions that you get asked all the time, usually as a homeschool parent. Okay, so Leslee, to homeschool, you have to have a ton of education experience. You've got to be super organized. You have to have a gorgeous state-of-the-art homeschool room in your house, right?
No. Let me answer that very personally. I definitely, talking about neurodiversity, definitely have chaos. So I had 4 kids in 4 years. And homeschooling them, my house, this is what I used to say to people, please come over anytime you'd like. But remember, I decorate in early childhood because there are things everywhere. And honestly, the chaos is beautiful. And it allows them to live in every aspect of their home. So you don't need to have it all together. You don't need, yes, I have a background as an attorney. What I tell people a lot is sometimes that can be a detriment. Just love your kids. If you love your kids and you know your kids, you can homeschool your kids.
When do you feel you really woke up to dysfunction in our school system?
Oh, that one I woke up. So my kids, as I said, we had 4 kids in 4 years. And my oldest went through 2nd grade, and my daughter through 1st grade. And I was very active in our public school system. I was VP of legislation on the PTA. And I read No Child Left Behind when it came out, and I went, oh no. Because my background, I actually kind of grew up on Capitol Hill. I'm an attorney, a litigator, and I kind of understand how everything works. And I was very active in the classroom, and I had already been feeling very uncomfortable with what I was seeing, and every decision that was being made was to push parents out of the way and to separate kids from parents. And this was over 20 years ago. Our oldest just turned 28. So this was happening, and I pulled my kids over 20 years ago. And I was seeing kind of the writing on the wall. And then the first time God put the idea of homeschooling in my head was I was asked to go to the NEA function that they have for PTA presidents and vice presidents. And I started to read the policies of the NEA. And right there it said, homeschooling should be abolished. It is a detriment to children. And I went, oh my goodness, you've got to be kidding me. That is horrible. And so that was what really started opening my eyes and shifting my thinking.
Let's talk a little bit about the realities of traditional schooling. Why is it that traditional school doesn't usually meet kids' learning needs, especially unique learning needs?
Right, that's a great question. And you know, there are so many different aspects to that, but traditional schooling it meets different learning styles in one way, but we've got a lot of different labels out there, right? We all are neurodiverse. If any of you came to my breakout sessions, you know, I talk about that. It's important to define our terms, and we hear that term neurodiverse all the time. And really, I look at it as a natural function of our brains. We're all different. We're all fearfully and wonderfully made. But the problem is when you are requiring, right, students to sit for lengthy periods of time, especially when they're younger, when you are requiring maybe too much reading or writing, and you're not taking into account maybe some differences, right? So there are a lot of labels. We can talk about ADHD, or they're given different labels and actually mislabeled often, which is something we can talk about. But the problem is that method just doesn't work for about 75 to 80% of kids, just because of all of these different learning styles. So they might do it, but they won't thrive.
Okay, so if traditional schooling methods work for about 20 to 25% of kids on average, what exactly is happening to the other 75% of kids in American schools?
Great question. And what happens is they fall through the cracks. They don't thrive. They act out. So when we're talking about like kids when they're younger, right, and you get the kids who will act out because it's not a character issue. We keep attributing that to character often, and usually it is not a character issue. It's the fact that they are not able to do what's being asked of them, but they don't have the capacity to know that. They just self-talk and say, oh, well, I must be stupid because everybody else in here is doing that. So we get this unfortunate cycle. So what's happening to these other kids is they're doing some self-talk where they're saying, well, I must be dumb. I must not be able to do this. I'm not very good at this. So what's happening is we're getting this crisis, right, of more not having that self-respect, that like Kathy Cook talked about earlier today, where it really undermines what parents are trying to do at home. And unfortunately, in traditional education, your kids are spending more time away from you than they are with you. And so that's another issue, right, is you've got this cycle. So what's happening to them is they're doing the best they can, but they're not thriving at all. And then you get the whole range. Sometimes they're acting out, so then they're labeled as bad kids or troublemakers, and then they just own that instead of owning the fact that they're brilliant in their own way. We heard from Dr. Carson this morning about, how he was a troublemaker and an F student. He's brilliant, but he just learns differently. So they're falling through the cracks, and they're getting different labels that aren't really accurate for them.
What are some surprising physical or environmental causes behind the behaviors that schools usually see, and then they just medicate them?
Yeah, so like we talked about with the acting out to that. So for example, ADHD is a huge one. That is a big label that is being put onto kids, and then medication is what's recommended so that they'll be docile and easier to control. And I want to throw this in as well, which you probably already know. I love your podcast. I love who you have on there, but the male and female brain is different. It is
Shocker, wait!
Imagine.
You can't say that, Leslee.
I know, heaven forbid. There is gray matter and white matter in our brain, and the white matter is connective tissue. So when male brains have more connective tissue, so when they move, things fire up more. They can think better. How many of you in here have boys like mine? I had a mini trampoline in my house at all times. And we would do our spelling words while they were bouncing up and down on the trampoline because their brains would work better, right? And so we have all of these differences, and we have all of these situations that are going on. And it's very, very important to understand that they're misdiagnosed. So like the ADHD, that's one aspect of it, right? Where they need the boys and they need them to be calm. They have to be able to sit. It's a character issue again. You need to be able to sit. Well, that's one issue. The other issue is the misdiagnoses of ADHD. So if you were in my breakout, I shared this. There are 18 diagnostics for ADHD, for example. Okay, there are 2 sets of 9 diagnostics. And if you have 6 from each column, you have ADHD. That's how they do it from DSM-6. So this is what most people don't know. 15 of those 18 are exactly the same for visual processing disorders. So, but if you talk to any well-educated, well-meaning, wonderful special ed teacher who's in the public school system, or talk to any teachers, they've never heard of it. They have no idea about it.
What is it?
So visual processing disorders can be anything from, a big one is convergence insufficiency is what it's called, okay? There's one, saccades, tracking. There are numerous different things, but what it is in general that so many people aren't aware of, when I talk about visual processing disorder, it's a neurological vision disorder. It is not your eyeballs. Our eyeballs are our camera, right? And so that needs to work well, right? So you're taking pictures and getting that information into the film, into your brain. Well, how is the brain utilizing that information? So what we're talking about now are neurological and visual processing within the brain. It is not necessarily a camera or an eyeball. So you can have a child that has 20/20 vision, but they still may have visual processing disorders going on. So for example, if you have a kid who, kind of closes one eye, or if you ever hear a child say, I don't like to read, that is a huge red flag, because no child doesn't want to read and learn. It's just a very natural thing. And any child, including my own, that I've worked with, who has said, yeah, I don't really like to read, every single one has needed vision therapy, and just been blown away and so excited and become the most voracious readers you've met.
Well, and a lot of times too, I've heard kids saying that, which has to do with what you're saying. It's because they can't.
Correct.
And they're also
Correct.
embarrassed.
Correct.
So they're just like, oh, I just don't
Correct.
like it. But really, they don't know how.
They don't know how, and they don't know how to tell the teacher exactly. They don't know how to tell them what's going on because they don't have the capacity. All they know is that, oh, all of their friends are able to do this and I can't. But the teacher, the parent, well-meaning, right? I did the same thing. My youngest would sit on my lap, and Mitchell would sit there and say, Mommy, I get headaches, read books with pictures. Well, I just attributed that to he's my number 4, and he always wanted to have his own way, a character issue, right? No, it wasn't. It turned out that he truly was getting headaches every single day. And that's not normal, which also came from his diet, we found out as well.
Oh, go into that.
Oh, yeah. So there are so many things that affect learning. I know. We definitely align on that one.
Gave me a bone. I took it.
Yeah. So there are so many different factors, right, that affect learning. And nutrition, sleep, and stress are so vitally important to kids, but also to parents, right? That you should be focused on that. Because if a kid doesn't have the foundation, how can they learn? If their brain isn't operating well, nothing is going to stick, nothing's going to go in. So focusing on the nutrition and getting the stress and the sleep figured out is critically important. So for example, so I'm going to bring up Mitchell. He couldn't be here. This is my baby, my number 4, 6'6", bodybuilder. So it cracks me up to introduce him that way. But he got this way because he had all the labels. So when he was 3, I noticed something was off, right? Emotionally, that emotional regulation. So how many of you in here, have that issue or have children with that issue, that dysregulation and being able to regulate themselves?
Well, it just depends on if you ask my ex-boyfriend.
There you go. There you go. And my husband. So I'm with you. So, I knew something was up. And it turned out, gluten, dairy, almonds, eggs, peanuts. This child, his whole gut flora was just completely out of whack. So that can affect anxiety. You keep hearing, they're anxious or, there's a lot of anxiety. I would recommend strongly the number one thing you look at is diet and getting the sugars and the grains out, because something is going on that your body is unable to somehow then get the nutrients to your brain that it needs. And how can we expect children to learn if they are not getting that? And I know you're a big proponent of how awful the food is in the school system, and I couldn't agree with you more. So wherever your child's going to be, whether it's at home or in school, making sure that they've got the proper nutrition so they can focus and so that they can learn is vitally important.
Just to encourage parents that have neurodivergent kids, what does intelligence look like in a neurodivergent kid?
I love that question. So neurodivergent kids, and I get this a lot, right? And I'll meet with families and I'll meet with the kids. It's very important that I meet the kids themselves. Within 5-10 minutes, I'll look at a parent, usually out of the hearing of the kids, I'll say, your child is super gifted. And they're like, well, no, not really, actually. They're really not. And they don't like to read and they don't. Here's why I say that. The questions they ask, how engaged they are, and the connections that kids make. Intelligence doesn't mean that your child has memorized the periodic table by the age of 5. We do that a lot, right? And say, oh, yes, they are. That's intelligent. There are so many different kinds of intelligence. Look at what Kathy just talked about on stage. She has the 8 different kinds. I love it. There are a lot of different kinds of intelligences, right?
And also, isn't early just memorizing things? Isn't that kind of an American culture thing?
That's a huge thing.
Oh, my kid's smart because they memorize things at an early age.
Correct. And they're able to, remember them and recall. Exactly. But intelligence and giftedness, often it comes with that label, like when you hear gifted. There's so much more to it. And what you're going to see a lot of times with neurodivergent kids is you're going to see a disconnect between the intellectual capacity and that ability to make connections that a lot of older kids cannot make between things, and emotional regulation. So you've got this capacity here of an intellectual capability, or like the questions they ask or the connections they make, or the drawings that they do, with also then their emotional age, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, is anybody in the audience a teacher in a regular school setting? Awesome. Okay, so my question would be, what are some things in a traditional school environment that can be triggering for a kid that struggles with sensory overload, that they could go back to school and they could tweak things in their classroom as best as they could? I know that some things are out of their control in a school building, but what are the biggest triggers for sensitive kids with sensory overload?
And sensory overload. One of the things that you can do, and I've seen this done, and we do it in different ways when we work with different programs, but is find a way that they don't feel isolated. One of the worst things you can do is separate them out. Right, especially when they're young. They feel very like, okay, now I'm different and now I'm terrible. And I work with a lot of teens who had that happen to them. Instead, try to find a way to situate their desk, okay, where they're not going to, even in their peripheral vision, have a lot of activity or other students. So if you can situate the desks where they're kind of able to either look out the window or more towards a wall, right? Maybe the whole classroom, you have times where you put up, the barriers work sometimes, like you'll have classrooms where they'll have like kind of a 3-walled barrier, and sometimes that can work very well because then you can have the kids decorate them, right? If you know that you have more than one kid that needs like a sensory change for that. Also providing an opportunity to decompress somehow. So if you can fix the schedule so that that individual child can be given a task that they can feel very proud about, but it will get them out of the classroom and kind of on their own and away from the chaos. Because it can be chaos to a child who has sensory overload just to be in a room with a lot of kids for a long period of time, right? Because kids are always, moving and so on and so forth. So those are some things that you can do.
For kids with severe special needs, is homeschooling an option for them, or is a traditional school setting sometimes what's best?
Well, and I wouldn't necessarily even say when you say a traditional school setting, but I think I know more like get them out of the house or have support and going to school, right? Or going to a program that might be supportive of that. And that really depends on the family. It really does. It depends on the support system the family has, the resources the family has, as well as the capacity, right, of mom and dad. So that one I would say really depends on the family in terms of, and what the special needs are. I mean, that is such a broad category, right? So for example, I have some clients who have nonverbal autistic kids who may or may not also be, can get very physical, right? And so there's a lot of burnout that comes from that level, right, for parents. And so having some kind of program where they can be confident, though, that the program is helpful. But I will tell you, a lot of the circumstances, the programs we have in the public schools, a high percentage of those are not very in keeping with what parents would want for their children. So it really is a balance. And then there are some phenomenal, for example, autism classrooms. Some of the people that work with me happen to be even in CPS, and she's phenomenal, right? And they have a great classroom. So it really depends on the resources, what the situation is. But yes, that can be very beneficial for both the child and for the family, because you might have other kids too who need some more attention.
How do we teach our kids to critically think?
Ooh, great question. You're hitting my law stuff now. I love it. Critically think, and I love this audience here, but I would say ask questions. It's the crux of a classical education. It's the crux of everything. Learn how to ask good questions. Learn how to ask your child why. That is kind of a joke. One of my nicknames when I was teaching is Mama D and leading mission trips with my teens and the kids I mentor. And they'd always say, oh my gosh, Mama D's favorite question is why, just don't go there, that kind of thing. But that is a wonderful way to develop that. And ask them why. And tell them, it's okay to say I don't know. And then explore that further. So that's one of my favorite suggestions. And then also, provide materials. One of my favorite resources is a critical thinking company, mind benders, analogies. Put in front of them logic puzzles. Put in front of them, play games that are strategic. Games are a phenomenal, phenomenal way to develop critical thinking and also relationship. So whether it be chess or Othello, Othello's a great one for two-person. Games are a phenomenal way, strategic games, to develop that critical thinking aspect. But critical thinking really, at its crux, is problem solving. So allow your child, this is the final one I'll say to this, is give your children an opportunity to solve their own problem. Don't always solve it for them. And that will develop critical thinking, because that is really at its core what it is solving problems.
How do you respond as a homeschool mom when someone says, aren't you worried your kid isn't going to be socialized enough?
Yeah, okay, admission time here. That was me. Okay, people say, oh, do you always want to homeschool your kids? I said, no. Remember, lawyer, I don't make my own food. I don't grow my own, or grow my own food. I don't make my own clothes. No, homeschooling, you've got to be kidding. And socialization. Well, my husband and I kind of laughed at each other when we brought that up, because one of the problems we had with the public school system when our kids were in it was the fact that first graders were teaching first graders how to behave, and that wasn't going so well. That just really didn't work. And we were really not happy with the socialization our children were getting. And what I said to my kids all the time, and I love it now because, as I said too, this is Mitchell's favorite question when he'll come with me when I speak, and he says, I want to take the socialization question. He said, we were raised in the world, and our socialization was with everybody from babies to adults. And our oldest, Timmy, this is to give you an example, when he was 14, he decided, yes, I do want to play travel baseball. Well, I don't know if any of you are in the travel sports world. Breaking in at 14 is rough, right? All these families have been together. He did make the team. And one day, a few weeks into practice, a dad came over to me and said, hi, introduced himself. And I said, hi, nice to meet you. And he said, can you please take my son home with you? Well, parents offer rides all the time, to each other's kids. So I'm like, sure, where do you live? And he goes, no, I don't think you understand me. He said, I want you to take my son home with you. And I'm like, I'm not sure how to respond to that. And he then went on to tell me that our son had been walking up to parents that he hadn't met yet. He walked up to them, looked him in the eye, according to this dad, shook their hand and said, hi, I'm Tim Dirnberger. I'm new to the team. I'm very excited to be here and play with your son. Whose parent are you? And the dad, and apparently all the parents, were just like, okay, who is this child? And are you really 14? And it didn't even register with us because we had taught our children to do that. But at 14, the dad just looked at me and he said, my son can't look anybody in the eye. He would never shake his hand. And his answers are one syllable, yeah, no, So, that is how socialization question gets answered. It's phenomenal. And they know how to talk to every age, every person.
I love that your son did that. And anytime I talk about how one day I want to be a homeschool mom, is that people are like, well, aren't you worried about them turning out weird? And I'm like, haven't you seen what's going on? 100 genders wearing a cattail. Like, I'm like, what? If that is normal, then I don't know what to tell you.
Furry today, guy tomorrow.
Exactly.
Right? Yes.
Like, okay, so that's the standard of normal? Like, no, I'll pass, thanks. Okay, so how can parents start customizing their child's education at home, even if they're not fully homeschooling?
Oh, absolutely. Wonderful. So like the resources that I just mentioned, surround your children, make your home a learning environment, almost without them realizing it. I mean, the critical thinking company that I mentioned to you, not a year ago, Mitchell and Jackson, his next older brother, they came downstairs like, Mom, do you have any of those mind benders laying around? Because, of course, I still have all the curriculum in the house. And I said, are you kidding? And they go, no, I feel like I want to do those. Surround your children with things like that from the critical thinking company, with things that they're passionate about. So whatever they're interested in, really let them dig into that. So find ways to put those kinds of things around them. If they're into trains, if they're into, look for ways to also expand their horizon in that area. So for example, if they're very into trains, find a retired conductor, take them on field trips, take them out to see the trains, find somebody who could maybe mentor them, who works in the train system, take them on the Metro into Chicago. So just find ways that you can really build their confidence, because you're really focusing on their strengths and their passions and their interests is a great way to do it. And like I said, surround them with games and learning toys. Yeah, those would be.
You are the author of School in Our National Parks and Some Secret Spots, and you say in that book that you can actually teach math and science and language arts without kids even realizing that they're doing school. So
Absolutely.
Could you give us a brief example of that?
Absolutely, yes. So I love it now because my kids are like, we're on to you, Mom. Everything's learning, isn't it? I'm like, yeah, you figured that out. But here's a perfect example. So the cover of the book, actually, I didn't even realize this when the picture was chosen. It's my 4 kids, and it happens to be the picture I took as we entered their very first national park. And it was the summer before we started to homeschool. And so my kids were 3 to 8. And while we were there, I was amazed at how much learning was happening, and here's how it happened. So we went and we saw petroglyphs. And we were at Petrified Forest National Park. And so we were sitting there, and I said, wow, I can't imagine how I could draw on a rock. And I said, how can I draw on a rock? Well, all 4 of my kids jumped in on that one and started to come up with all these different ways and all these different things. And I said, wow, I wonder what that would have looked like. And so then we started to talk about what that would have looked like, how their life would have been. Then we started to talk about, okay, if we were going to make up a story about somebody your age, by the time we got to the hotel that night, my older 2 were frantically writing in their journals this entire story that they thought of. My daughter, who's a graphic designer, was drawing her pictures. The other 2 were asking for help, and they literally had written and drawn about 10 pages in their journals. 10 pages at 7, 6, okay. And so then we got ice cream afterwards, okay? We went to get ice cream, and I said, I wonder why that one costs more than that one. And immediately my oldest said, well, because there's more in it. And I said, how much more is in it? And so we wrote the numbers down. We asked them. And he goes, And I said, well, which one's a better value? He's like, well, what's that? And all the kids are listening at this point. You could just did math. Like an incredible math. While we were driving, I would say, how long do you think it's going to take us to get to here? Well, how far is that? They all had maps, by the way. There was no GPSing, no electronics. It was all, we had printed off maps. And so while we went, he would estimate and learn to estimate how far. And sometimes he was way off, and we'd laugh and laugh. And then he started to get really good at it. There's math. When we were in the national parks, we would discover all kinds of things, and you don't have to do anything. They say, well, Mom, that's an owl pellet? What's an owl pellet? I don't know. Let's go find out. I knew what an owl pellet was. Let's go find out. And for an hour, we did science at the next national park we were at. It was incredible.
Okay, so fun question as we wrap here. Which national park should every family try to visit and homeschool in this year?
Oh, man. Okay, there's too many, and I haven't visited enough, but I have to say Yellowstone has an incredible variety. Yellowstone is amazing, truly amazing, and you need to spend multiple days there because you can talk about and go see different flora, fauna, and different phenomena there. That is incredible. So I guess I have to say Yellowstone. But a secret spot that I highly recommend, that's in the book, is to take your kids beach camping in Carpinteria, California. If anybody's heard of Carpinteria, it is a little town south of Santa Barbara and Goleta, just south of there, and you can beach camp there. And they have incredible tide pools, and it is one of the most wonderfully unique experiences, and a lot of people don't know. Now, that's a state park, but it is one of the secret spots in there, so I'd recommend both of those.
Leslee, Dirnberger, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.